Welcome back to part 4 of today's lecture series, Art in Daily Life and Death. In this section and in the next couple sections, I'm just going to introduce a couple of common contexts in which we see a lot of this plebeian style art showing up. And the first is the lararium, or the household altar, which I mentioned briefly in the last video. Most Roman houses have, and many Roman businesses too, have lararia, which are either niches or built structures that are set aside for the household gods and for offerings and statues to those household gods. So here's just an example that I chose because it was very recently excavated and is in beautiful condition. And in this example, you can see some of the most common features that we find, which are these serpent images, usually curling up from a ground line or from even below ground and approaching an altar which is laden with fruits and foods. So here we have two flanking snakes curling in towards the altar at the center. Plant and decoration showing plants and showing gardens is also extremely common in these areas, as are images of the household gods themselves, and you'll see those better in the next example that I show you, which is here. So here's another lararium painting. In this case, it is one that is now in the Naples Archaeological Museum. And here we see once again our serpents. Sometimes these are known by the Greek term agathodaimon, the good demon, which is a Greek god associated with grains and growing and earth and vineyards. So maybe not directly applicable into the Roman sphere, but an analog that we can think about, some sort of earth god representing the sort of cycles of life and death. And then up here, we see another god that is at the center of the household cult, and this is called the Genius, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And this represents the sort of spirit of and guardian spirit of the paterfamilias, the center of the household, the male center of the household, represents a part of that sort of focal point of power within the household. So the genius of the household is usually represented as a man holding a cornucopia, as you can see here, and in this capite velato state, right, with the toga pulled over his head as he is doing a religious ritual. And here we have him sacrificing at an altar. Two other things that we usually see or often see in these contexts are the lars, which are another household god, very important to the household cult and somewhat mysterious, right? Like exactly what a lar is not entirely clear, but we do see from their images they are usually twinned, dancing or sort of gesturing males holding a cornucopia, oftentimes pouring, in this case wine, it looks like, out. And wearing a sort of Bacchic crown. And so these, again, seem to sort of represent some sort of household abundance or good luck. And domestic cult was really about preserving the sort of family unit and keeping the spirits of the ancestors good and at bay. The Romans really had a lot of rituals about ghosts and about sort of good and negative spirits out in the world. So these sort of protective household deities were really important and were the subject of sort of daily rituals and daily rites within the household. If we look at one more example here, you can see this is another example from Pompeii. Once again, we have our snaky, slithering serpent, sort of using the coils to show slithering movement up the towards an altar once again. And in the background of this particular example, we also see another god, not the Lares, not the Genius, but Bacchus himself, dressed up as a bunch of grapes, pouring wine into the mouth of his companion panther, which you can see better here, on the slopes of a very lush-looking conical mountain. And oftentimes this mountain has been interpreted as an image of Mount Vesuvius prior to the eruption, which we know from literary sources and also from geological investigations lost a good chunk, about the top third of its height in the 79 CE eruption. So in this case, the lararium not only sort of shows some of the typical features of the household cult, but also a sort of personalization, a little bit of a cheerful reference perhaps to the family business, to farming the slopes of Mount Vesuvius nearby, being involved in the wine trade. So the sort of commercial linkage can even begin in the household, thinking about in the household how you represent your commercial interests and your stake in the larger world. In all cases, these lararia have these sort of features of plebeian art, not entirely. Right here we have a very classicizing looking Bacchus apart from his grape body, which is unusual. But the snakes and these serpents are done in a sort of loose rendering. They're full of movement a little bit. There's not so much attention being paid to perspective and rendering a sort of naturalistic scene. It's more about the sort of emblematic impact of what you can see. Not all lararia are done in a sort of popular style, so here's a more classicizing example from the House of the Vedii, which is a wealthy freedman's house in Pompeii. Common places where you would find these household altars include kitchens, courtyards, shops, and sometimes you would find them in the atrium as well, so in that open roofed room that sort of starts the circulatory pattern of the average Roman domus. Less common locations include the sort of rooms of representation, so the fanciest places of the house, atrium aside. This sort of seems to imply that at least painted lararia are more often the preserve of service people and lower class members of the household, so your freedmen, your slaves, rather than cultivated directly by the paterfamilias and the sort of central family of the household. In households where we have multiple lararia, it may even be the case that there are separate acts of devotion and separate practices of the cult for the sort of central family and for the service people. Perhaps you might have a lovely built marble lararium in one room for the use of the family and the more elite members of the household, and a painted rustic niche in another for the use of the slaves of the household. So not all lararia are in the plebeian style, and not all lararia seem to be for lower class people, but many are. And in many cases, part of the responsibility of slaves and other members of the household would be to actually not only do all the work to keep the household running, but also to do the religious work to keep the household safe as well. So what I want you to do now is to return to your responses from the previous questions and reflect, if you need to, a little more broadly on the visual culture that surrounds or maybe surrounded your patterns of daily life. And then write 2 to 3 sentences about whether or not you think there is space within institutional visual culture for personal touches. There may be examples where there is no room for that, and that in and of itself would be really interesting. And then there are places where you may have the sort of institutional visual culture that is challenged or reinforced or in some way operates with personal touches as well. And then what roles do individualized aesthetics, those moments in which the sort of institutional framework is not shaping the visual, how do those play into the public realm? So what kinds of moments of art do we see in our daily patterns that do not, that sort of have a grassroots source to them rather than being institutionally created? That's it, and I will see you next time.